so when you see that kind of activity, and the whole idea of torture, there was a manual, the whole School of the Americas, they had a manual on torture where we were teaching torture techniques to Central American security forces. That was a big scandal back then in the 80s. So the whole Abu Ghraib thing is nothing new, okay? So this kind of thing was going on. I was aware of it, that this was my wake-up to the fact that the U.S. is fully capable of pulling off this kind of thing, right, and getting involved with things that were so blatantly illegal, immoral, evil, any way you want to look at it, right, that for it to be happening here, the only difference was it was happening here. And so it was not a big surprise, or it was not something beyond the pale that American security agencies could get involved with stuff like this. So that wasn't my hang-up in looking at this. My sense is follow the evidence. And anybody it points to, that's who the evidence is pointing to. And if it's pointing at Americans, so be it. And Americans are not more moral than the rest of the world, despite our myths.
Right. Well, there's good people and bad people in every bunch. And when you say Americans, it's not overall everybody in America. It's just these criminal elements within these intelligence agencies, etc.
Whether it's done because they're criminals or whether it's done because of distorted, misguided ideas of what it is to be patriotic.
Well, yeah, okay.
Following orders or whatever they're doing, it's still atrocious, They're atrocities in a literal sense. I mean, that's the meaning of the word atrocious, right?
Right.
So, hey, we've been committing atrocities and covering it up for a long time. So there's people out there, even in the employ of the government, through the military, through the other agencies, that are fully capable on a moral playing field. They're fully capable of being involved in something like this. Mm-hmm. Hey, the way I put it is this. Somebody did it. Why is it that people jump to the conclusion that the only people they can imagine who would be so evil would be these sneaky foreigner-looking people,
These people want to kill you for your freedoms.
Yeah. You can make up whatever you want, but people don't want to believe that we share in the same condition of humanity, that each person has as much capacity for evil and good as any other person. So that's my fundamental position there from my theological point of view, is we are not somehow on a different plane just because we're white-skinned, right, or because we were born in this country, or because of what happened in 1776 or anything else. There's people in this country who are just as capable of doing this as people in the Middle East, Christians versus Muslims versus atheists, it doesn't matter what. Mm-hmm. But to try to pin it on the Muslims and try to pin it on Middle Easterners and so forth is fundamentally a racist kind of a ploy, and it's baloney.
Well, yeah, I think it's safe to say that there were people from all different races, creeds, and religions involved in this criminal operation.
Yep, and none of that's relevant. They were, they might have felt like they were working toward a larger good. I'm sure the military rationalizes things that way, that this is the cost of starting the war, which is needed in order to achieve the goals that we have to, keep the energy flowing, and whatever the business is that they're rationalizing this on. I mean, people can come up with their own reasons, but it's fundamentally wrong. So, I mean, I don't buy it that just because we're running out of oil, we have a right to go and, start wars anywhere just to keep our position and.
Well, I guess, if we wanted to do it for the oil, I mean, we could have attacked Saudi Arabia instead of Iraq. But for some reason they decided to go into Iraq instead of Saudi Arabia, even though, 15 of the hijackers were Saudi Arabian, et cetera. But
well, we've already sort of co-opted. I mean, the U.S. and Saudis are such close allies already.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So we were basically, we were allies with Saddam up until he stopped being cooperative. We were allies with Noriega down in Panama until he stopped being so cooperative. And all of a sudden we just, we say, okay, we're done with you. and then they switch gears. So, yeah, we've been involved with all these guys. So it's not as though Saddam Hussein was evil and the leaders of Saudi Arabia are good. Leaders of Saudi Arabia are dictators. I mean, they're not doing very good by their people.
Right.
And neither was Saddam or neither of a lot of these folks. But on the other hand, Saddam was actually one of the more progressive leaders in the Middle East. I mean, the level of education, the level of women's rights, all these kinds of things were advanced in Iraq compared to, say, Afghanistan.
Right.
I mean, a lot of these other countries. And so we just sort of, we had to paint him with some kind of a brush. I'm going to go back. The first time I had an inkling, this was way back before the 1990, Gulf War and all that. In fact, it was a year before the first Gulf War. There was a cover of Time magazine that came out, Time or Newsweek, one or the other, I think it was Time, that came out with Saddam Hussein on the cover and talking about here's the new Hitler. And I thought, what in the world? Who is this guy, and why are they calling him the new Hitler? I said, I bet we're going to try to bump this guy off. And sure enough, they just would not let go. They just kept changing the goalposts around until they could arrange a war with Iraq. So you could see that one coming. This whole thing is so contrived.
As someone pointed out to me the other last week concerning the war with Iraq, they had told me to look into the whole issue with Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame and the fraudulent documents that said that Saddam was getting yellow cake from Niger, which led to the Iraq War and the whole shock and awe situation there. But he said that was a really important issue for people to look into. But well, you're one person that you've expanded a lot of areas of study when it comes to looking into September 11th. And one thing I really want to thank you for was putting, your name out there when you knew there was going to be a lot of blowback concerning the Pentagon and, whether there was a plane there or not. I think there's, between the physical evidence and the eyewitness testimony, I think we can safely say that a plane did hit the Pentagon. But one of the things that I remember you and John Bursell talking about in the interview you did with him was how a lot of people assume that they would know what a crash, a commercial airline crash looks like at those speeds, when that's just not the case. Where most people are used to seeing a crash happening at, say, maybe 200 miles per hour or something like that. When this plane crashed into the Pentagon, well, all these planes, the Pentagon and the World Trade Centers, they were going over 500 miles an hour. I think the one that hit the Pentagon was going near 560 miles an hour. And you had
I don't know the exact numbers offhand, but the point I made with him, and I'll say it again for your listeners here, is that it comes down, there's a particular little formula that shows up in introductory physics called kinetic energy. And the formula is the kinetic energy is of an object that's moving, is 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. And what that means is if you double the mass, you're doubling the energy. Okay? If you double the velocity, since it's squared, you're getting 4 times the energy. If you triple the velocity, you get 9 times the energy. So why is it that you could have a slowly rolling freight car of a train going a few miles an hour, and it would have as much momentum as a bullet, but it has very low kinetic energy. So if you're there, you could get bumped and you say, oh, and you get out of the way. But if you have a bullet, it's going to tear right through you. And even though they have the same momentum, they have a very different amount of energy because it's much more sensitive to velocity than it is to the mass. Okay. So what happens when you have something with a lot of energy is like an airplane flying at 500 miles an hour. I could do the calculation again. I guess we were comparing, in that show, I was comparing a crash at 200 miles an hour with 550 miles an hour. Okay. It was somewhere between 7 and 8 times the kinetic energy, okay?
Right.
in other words, all of that kinetic energy has to become dissipated, or has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. That energy is used to tear things up or heat things up or do something before all those pieces come to rest. So with 8 times the kinetic energy of a typical crash, it's going to do things to the plane that are way different than what you'd commonly expect. And so they're saying, how come there was no large pieces of a plane? I mean, there were a couple of pieces lying around, but most people, the intuition would say there ought to be chunks of plane all over the place. Where's the tail? Where's the
right, like they would be thinking huge pieces of the fuselage still sitting there and stuff.
There ought to be things scattered around. But the one visualization aid for this was there's on YouTube. In fact, I downloaded it and reprocessed it to clip out a lot of the garbage. So it's a nice clean one. It's a Phantom jet that they had on a test track on the desert, and they crashed it into a wall similar to the kind of wall they'd use on a nuclear reactor. They're trying to test the safety of these nuclear reactors against.
Okay, that's the F-4 Phantom Sandia test,
Yeah. So they crashed this thing into the wall, and it's just absolutely amazing to watch. This thing's going at approximately 500 miles an hour, and it just sort of, it's not literally vaporizing. It's not vapor. It's small pieces.
Right.
But it literally turns this plane into confetti. You have to see it to even get the picture of what it would do to that plane. Now, the thing that's a relevant insight here is people say, well, that's a small plane. It's a very different situation. Well, if you scale it up, so you have a regular airliner going at the same speed, you would have the same amount of kinetic energy per kilogram of material. So there's the same amount of energy per unit of material that's there. It's going to do the same total amount of damage, and it's going to run to the, a commercial airliner would basically be as pulverized as that F-4 Phantom was. And so, first of all, the wall apparently at the Pentagon was not as sturdy as that test strip wall because it penetrated it.
Right.
And so it did a lot of damage inside. What it's going to do is just sort of smash like a bug on a windshield.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look a lot like a bug when it's hit your windshield, does it? I saw a little booklet where it was almost a joke. It was looking at bug splats and trying to do identify bugs from the splats, I mean, it was a joke. But I mean, so it would be this airplane is splatting against the wall. It's not going to, your intuition is not a good guide to what you ought to expect to see. And that was the main point I made with John Bursell.
Right, and I thought that was an excellent point, how people just assume that they would know what high-speed crash looks like when they really don't have anything to compare it to, except maybe the Sandia test. Right,
and if you look at that, and it just sort of opens your mind and say, oh my God, look at that.
Mm-hmm. So it would seem that, a lot of people, I don't know what your experience is with it, but I go and I look at a lot of forums and stuff and see what people are talking about. And when it comes to the Pentagon, a lot of people are seriously misinformed when they try and say that there's no plane wreckage and that there's only a 16-foot in diameter hole, when that's just not true.
Mm-hmm. I have pretty studiously avoided even going there for the Pentagon because, there's some things you can say about it, but the real substantial evidence is at the World Trade Center. The guys inside the Pentagon are the ones that hold all the cards when it comes to the evidence. And as Frank Legg has pointed out, he did a very good analysis of the dangers of having too much certainty about, or expressing too much certainty about what happened at the Pentagon. The basic bottom line is, if you get so the main focus of the truth movement is on the Pentagon, mm-hmm. and you're making all these wild assertions that can be proved to be wrong, then they're going to pull out the cards and show that you're wrong and try to paint the whole truth movement with this broad brush and totally ignore or sweep over all this that we've accomplished at the World Trade Center.